So we decided to do something a little bit different as a senior leadership team to talk to you about this business of courageous and inspirational leadership and some experiences that we've had in our lives and some leaders who have inspired us. And just share those experiences so that we can talk about this incredible gift that we've been given, which is the opportunity to lead. And it's a gift that's given by those that we serve. And so we're going to just share some stories with you and then open it up for Q&A.
Absolutely. Next slide. The first courageous and inspirational leader I'd like to share with you, this is Lieutenant Colonel Tara Opolowski. Colonel Opolowski is the Security Forces Commander at Kadena Air Base in Japan. Now, she's a Purdue graduate. She is airborne, trained air assault. She's been to the FBI Academy. She's a Raven. She graduated from the U.S. Marine Corps Command and Staff College. She has 10 assignments, 4 deployments, and she's on her 3rd consecutive tour as a Security Forces Squadron Commander, currently with about 460 airmen under her charge. So basically, she's a badass. But that's not necessarily why I'm inspired by her. I'm inspired by her. I first met her when she was the Security Forces Commander at Lakenheath when I was stationed in USAF. I'm inspired by her because of the way she engages, not only with her senior leadership team, her chief, Dana Council, and her first sergeant, CMSAF Sergeant Hollis. I mean, this is probably one of the best examples of, when we talk about the triad, the commander, the first sergeant, and the chief. This is probably one of the best examples that I've ever seen in my Air Force career of a leadership team that works together. But I'm inspired by the way she highlights and the way she takes care of her airmen. She's tough. I told you about her background. So she's tough, but she's fair. And at any given time, and so a lot of people follow me on Facebook. If you want to know who I follow Colonel Opolowski because of all the inspirational things she does. She's a PT juggernaut. She's intimately involved in the lives of all of her airmen. I mean, she is just an all-around fantastic leader. And someone that hopefully, with the little time that I have left, and we have kind of a mentor-mentee relationship. She mentors me on occasion. On occasion, I'll pass some of my thoughts to her. But just an amazing leader that I'm actually proud to serve with. So, and when I asked her if she had any thoughts that I should pass along to you all, the one thing she told me was, hey, she tries to instill mutual respect at all levels. And if each of us as leaders could do the same, if we could treat our airmen with love and mutual respect the way that we would want to be treated, a lot of our problems would actually go away. And she does all of this while being a single parent to her daughter, 12-year-old daughter, Reagan. Ladies and gentlemen, this is one of our most courageous and inspirational leaders, Lieutenant Colonel Tara Opolowski.
So I'm a firm believer that no officer in the United States Air Force becomes successful at the very senior ranks without being raised by a great senior NCO and great NCOs. And you always know when you're about to learn something because, NCOs have a code. Especially chiefs have a code, right? And it starts off with, sir, ma'am, do you have a minute? Which, of course, the answer to that is always, yes. And then you know you're about to learn something if the next thing you hear is, with all due respect. So let's bring up the next slide. This is my first chief, Chief Jimmy Kelly. And I was a young squadron commander, and I hadn't had a chance to really work with a chief before, and Jimmy Kelly raised me. And one of the lessons of the many that he taught me that I wanted to share this morning, he walked in one morning, I was working on something, and he says, hey, sir, you got a minute? I said, absolutely, Chief, come on. And he come in and closed the door, and he walked in, and he said, and he pulled something out of his pocket. And he put it on my desk, and he says, sir, he goes, you ought to take a look at this. He goes, this ought to make you mad, because it makes a lot of your airmen mad. And I picked it up, and I looked at it. And I turned it around, and I kept staring at it and looked around it, and I said, Chief, I ain't getting it. What are you trying to teach me here? And he said, well, sir, read the box. And so I read it. It said, Johnson & Johnson flesh-colored Band-Aids. And he says, yep. He goes, that'll make you mad because it makes a lot of your airmen mad. And I stared at that box, and I kept turning it around, and I put it around, and I kept looking at it. I said, Chief, I ain't getting it. What are you trying to teach me? And he sort of had a little glimmer in his eye. He says, let me show you. And he pulled open a box, he ripped out a Band-Aid, and he pulls it off, and he puts a pink Band-Aid on his African-American skin, and he says, you know what? He goes, that ought to make you mad. It makes a lot of your airmen mad. Then he winked, and he walked out. So what's the moral of the story as leaders, as servant leaders? I couldn't see it. I could have stared at that thing for weeks, and I would never have seen it. Because my life experiences, I've never actually been the only one of me in a room. Every time I've been in a room in my entire career, most of the people in that room look like me, sound like me. I've never been the only African American, Asian American, Hispanic American, Asian. I've never been in a room where perhaps I was scrutinized to a different level. I've never been the only woman in an organization who has everything I'm saying scrutinized to a completely different level, have had people say things to me that they thought were funny but that were actually sort of degrading. To be wearing uniforms and equipment that were actually never designed for me, but I just sort of suffer in silence. To go strap into an airplane and fly a 9-hour sortie and put a vest on that was actually built for men. See, I've never had those experiences because most of what my experience has been all about people that are like me. So how do we as servant leaders, how do we lead in that environment? I think the first thing we do is we acknowledge that we all have blinders on as leaders. And there are certain things that we are not going to be able to see in our organizations. And I think once we acknowledge that, we also have to acknowledge that there are flesh-colored Band-Aids in every squadron. It's going on. And so the only way we can see them is to surround ourselves and build our teams in ways that others can point them out for us. And recognize the fact that the culture of the United States Air Force has to be the big tent culture. Because if you go to a high school and look at the kids and ask yourself, who lines up to join the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, Marine Corps? What kind of kid is going to be, who's going to see themselves in the culture of each of those? And there's been studies done on what kind of kid lines up in each line. Our line should generally be the longest. Not because of any parochial or competitive nature, but because think about the nature of what we do. We do leaflets to nukes and everything in between. We operate from 65 feet below the surface to the outer reaches of space and anywhere in between. And we're involved in every single mission that the United States military and our coalition partners are involved in. And so we got to have kids that line up and say, you know what? First kid in line says, you know what? I've been talking to this guy named General Raymond, and I want to go into space. And that kid's got to see themselves in the United States Air Force. And we got to embrace that kid and bring them in, and our culture's got to be inclusive of that kid. And the next kid in line says, I want to be a JTAC. And our culture's got to be embrace that kid. The next one wants to be a pilot. The next one wants to be a cyber operator. The next one wants to do all the things that we do as an Air Force. And we have got to embrace them. And they got to see themselves in us. And so for me, celebration of diversity and making sure that we understand the flesh-colored Band-Aids, it's not about being politically correct. It's a warfighting imperative. Because the challenges we face as a nation are wicked hard. And it's going to take folks with different backgrounds, different life experiences, and different perspectives to be able to come in and sit down together and provide the creative solutions that we as a nation need to be able to fight and win.
You know, the video that we watched earlier was centered around squadron commanders. But there's a group of individuals sitting in this area, your MAGCOM command chiefs and a few of the other senior chiefs across our Air Force that are also working to make sure that we develop our squadron superintendents. Very, very important to that triad that I talked about, first sergeants, squadron superintendents, and squadron commanders. I want to tell you about my first squadron superintendent. Next slide. This is the infamous Joe Wimbush. And Joe Wimbush started to mentor me the day before I arrived at my first duty station. So I graduated from tech training, and I had 7 days of leave, and I decided, 7 days is not enough, so I called my unit and said, hey, I'm supposed to be there tomorrow, but I think I'll show up sometime next week. And whoever answered the phone said, okay, hold on. And they gave the phone to one of these Joe Wimbush. He picked up the phone and said, hey, who is this? I said, sir, this is Airman Wright, and I'm supposed to be there tomorrow. And before I got it all out, he said, I tell you what, you better have your blank here tomorrow at this time. And so I got my blank on a Greyhound bus from Columbus, Georgia, and I got to Fayetteville, North Carolina at the time that I was supposed to. As I was coming down the steps of the bus, Joe Wimbush grabbed me by my BDU collar at the time and read me the Riot Act. And then he read me the Riot Act all through my time as an airman, all through my time as an NCO, all through my time up until today. If I got him on speakerphone right now, he'd read me the Riot Act. He was very tough, but he was fair, and he treated me like his son. If you ever hear me today referring to my pops, it's Joe Wimbush. When I went on my first deployment, he knew the type of, and I think I've talked to you about the type of airman that I was, not in very good shape. He knew the type of airman that I was, so he decided, I think I better get on this deployment and go with him. And he beat me up on that deployment. And my biological mother actually passed away during this deployment, and Joe Wimbush was right there. When I got back, he all but adopted me into his family. He allowed me to be mischievous. He's from the inner city of Pittsburgh, so he knew my type. He allowed me to be mischievous. He allowed me to be slick. But there was always a knife. I didn't even know what a knife hand was back then, but there was always a knife hand. There was always a teaching moment. There was always an opportunity that he allowed me to grow. What I'll tell you is everything that I am today as a professional, as a man, and everything that I'm not, it's because of Joe Wimbush. And I can only hope that for all of our enlisted airmen and for all of our junior officers and for all of our senior officers, that you have a Joe Wimbush, a courageous leader, an inspirational man in your life like I did. I would not be here today had it not been for this man. And I want to personally and publicly thank him and my mom, Miss Diane Wimbush, for everything that they've done for me throughout my career. Yeah.
So this may be surprising for you to hear from the chief, but a couple words that I rarely ever use is safety first. Because you know what? What we do sometimes is an inherently unsafe business. I actually know how to do safety first. It's stop flying. I mean, when you're at 160 knots and you got 3,000 feet of runway left and you got an engine that coughs on you and you got 3 seconds to make a life and death decision, that environment is not safe. But here's how we get through it. Here's the words I do use. Discipline first. Because if we're disciplined, we're going to be safe. And here's the guy that taught me that. All right, so there's probably some smiles by some of the retirees in the crowd because this guy is somewhat of a legend. This is Lieutenant Colonel Billy Deal. And Billy Deal was my first squadron commander. And he's the guy that took me to war. And sometimes we as leaders have got to decide between, what's the right decision when we're either having safety issues or something's going the wrong way, because, sometimes the decision is to throttle back and reset. But, sometimes the decision is to throttle up and push it up. And and the person that has the best knowledge and the understanding of where the unit is the command team working together. So I want to describe for you my first experience in combat, because this is the guy who got me ready. And he got me and my teammates ready by teaching us about discipline. And so we're getting ready during Desert Shield, and we're doing all these workups, and then it's time for our first mission. And like everyone, this is the only guy, by the way, who had combat time in our squadron. He'd been a MiG killer in Vietnam. The rest of us were all green. And so we're getting ready to go into combat for the very first time, and we're uttering that prayer that airmen have uttered since the beginning of war fighting, right? Which is, please God, don't let me let my buddies down. And you're always sort of wondering, how am I going to react to the enemy? What's going to happen when I see my first surface-to-air missile? What's going to happen? How am I going to react? Is my training going to come through for me? So there we were, full package going across day one of Desert Storm, and we get across the line, and as you might imagine, heart rates are up a little bit, and we're doing our work, and the next thing I know, Billy Deal comes across on the radios like a walk in the park. He says, "Hey, there's AAA. Anti-aircraft artillery. There's AAA right 2 o'clock, right?" And all of us stare and go, "Wow, look at that, AAA right 2 o'clock, right?" And then the same calm voice comes across and says, SA2, left 10 o'clock. And we all, whoo, look at that. Surface-to-air missile. We could see it because it was pretty big, like a telephone pole, and it climbs up to about 35,000 feet above the formation and explodes, and we're all looking at it. And then we hear on the radio, splash, MiG-29, because I was far enough forward in the formation, right? I see an aircraft hit the ground and explode. And I remember that moment in my cockpit like it was yesterday. Because all of a sudden I realized none of this was new. I actually had been in this environment before. This exact environment before. I'd seen these formations. I'd heard these radio calls. I'd seen the radar warning receiver screaming at me. I'd heard that before. I'd seen Smoky Sam simulators. I'd seen AAA simulators. I'd never seen an airplane actually hit the dirt before. But I'd heard all the radio calls before, and I realized I was in an environment that was actually not new. I'd done all of this before at Red Flag, just months prior. And what that experience taught me and continues to teach us is the importance of confidence under fire. And this guy put us through the ringers. And he was tough as nails on us. And he made sure that we bled in training so we were not going to bleed in combat. And I would offer to us as leaders that there's a lot of things that we do the best we can. There's one obligation we have that I would tell you is nothing short of sacred duty. It's our mirror check as leaders. And that's to ensure that every airman that we send into harm's way is properly organized, trained, equipped, and well led, so they can go forward and do the nation's business. And then when they return home, we've taken care of their families while they're gone. That's sacred duty for us. Everything else, hey, we'll do the best we can. That one, as servant leaders, we got to get right. And it was Billy Deal who taught me.
Again, we just wanted to share some of the individuals in our lives that have inspired us. But what we're really here to do, and what we like doing most, and what helps us inspire the changes and the improvements and helps us do our jobs, is hearing from you. So we like to squint with our ears and turn it over to you for any questions that you might have for me or the chief.
All right, thank you. Thank you, General Goldfein, Chief Wright. Have some really good questions, obviously. So let's get right into the first one. In an era of great power competition, why is innovation important?
Yeah, you know, so was that spark tank pretty cool or what? I mean, that was spectacular. And what's neat is it's happening all over our Air Force. Wing commanders are doing this. We push innovation money out. We've got the second tranche of that, and hopefully what's happening across the Air Force is that that airmen are realizing we're really serious about this pushing decision authority and resources down to the squadron level, focused on and built on a foundation of trust, and the fact that we trust our commanders and our command chiefs and our senior NCOs to get after it. You know, the story that always reminded me, and I've used this before, but it's the, you know, it's the story of the F-117 and how it came to be, right? So as the last guy to actually check out in the F-117, what I really enjoyed about that experience was meeting and spending time with the community, both those in Skunk Works and also those who, for years, right? Because most folks don't remember, we flew that thing for 9 years with the highest levels of classification. And many believe that the former Soviet Union sort of spent themselves into oblivion trying to figure out how to counter it. And so how did it came to be, right? Well, so there's this guy named Dennis Overholzer, right? He's a young engineer, and his idea of a good time on weekends was reading journals, technical journals that had been translated into English. And he's reading this Russian journal, and he sees in there the math equation for what now we call stealth. And he walks into Ben Rich, Ben, the CEO at Skunk Works, and he says, and he puts a model, a wooden carving of what now we would look like a Hope diamond. He said, and Ben Rich looks up and says, "What's that?" He said, "Well," he goes, "This will return the radar cross section of a part of an eagle." And he says, "Well, you mean an eagle?" He says, "No, an eagle's eye." And then Ben Rich said famously, "Well, can you get it airborne?" And he says, "Well, I can try." And so then they started working on it, and they came to the Pentagon and came into my conference room now. And Ben Rich came in and had the Chief Staff and the Secretary of Defense. And Ben Rich pulls a marble out of his pocket and he rolls it across the table. And the Secretary says, "What's that?" He goes, "That's the radar cross-section return of what I'm about to build you." And then the rest, of course, is history. And so the question for us as an institution is, are we ready to accept the marble? Can the marble get to leaders who can then make decisions at the right level to take action? Or will it die 100,000 bureaucratic deaths along the way? And so what we're trying to establish across the Air Force is an environment where good ideas get a hearing, but not only a hearing, they get immediate resources to go forward and solve our toughest challenges at the right level in our Air Force.
Okay, Chief, it's interesting. There's a lot of folks in this crowd that want to replace you in a couple of years, so that's probably a good thing. But here's the question. Both you, Chief Wright, and our Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Dave Goldfein, are Dallas Cowboy fans. This is a real question. So I want to be the next Kaleth Wright. General Goldfein, do I have to violate my oath of integrity and everything in the name of decency and good judgment and become a Dallas Cowboy fan if I want to replace Chief Wright?
Let me think about this for a second. Yes. Chief, why don't you take that one?
Hey, that was the only reason I got the job.
Okay, we'll let that one go. All right. With the increased emphasis on mental health and work-life balance, what should service before self mean to our airmen in garrison today?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. Sometimes, I've been in situations personally, and I've heard from many of our airmen about this idea of service before self. That when an airman wants to take care of him or herself or their family, sometimes supervisor or commander or a flight chief or whatever would say, "Hey, service before self. You owe it to this Air Force before you take care of yourself." And I'm not certain that that's what that means as one of our core values, and I'm not certain that that's what was meant when it was written today. And I've been a huge proponent over the last couple of years about this idea that, hey, you can't take care of any of your airmen if you don't take care of you. You know, I've talked about the importance of putting your mask on first. And so when you talk about service before self, obviously we're in the service business. Obviously we voluntarily raised our hands and joined the Air Force, and we want you to be dedicated to your job. We want you to be dedicated to our mission. We want you to be dedicated to the people that you serve. But I also want you to be dedicated to taking care of you. Because all too often, and I know somebody mentioned this morning about the folks in the front row, I think it was General Raymond, those of us who are a little bit older, when you get our age and you start trying to take care of yourself, sometimes it's too late. And I mean, it's really simple. You can't take care of them. You can't be your best on the console, in the cockpit, in the warehouse, on the gates. You can't take care of the mission if you don't take care of you. And so when I think about this idea of service before self, you know, again, obviously, yes, mission first, but don't ever neglect and ignore yourself, and certainly don't ever neglect and ignore your family when it comes to being effective.
Okay, I had several questions along this same subject, and it's for both of you. Chief Wright, I know you recall you and I had the pleasure of doing a mentorship leadership session over at Andrews a couple of weeks ago, and it was really a great event. But one of the questions we got over and over, the audience, as it seemed, knew both of our stories, which means neither of us were model airmen when we initially came in. Although it's hard to imagine now, looking at us both, but both of us had hair that was too long back then, and we had mustaches that were too long. But that was back in the day, and those days are past us now. But the question is, what would you both say to airmen who have stumbled and who didn't start off, maybe it's coming out of the gate really quick, but now they want to continue on and have a great career? What would you say to an airman that wants to be the next Chief Goldfein or the next Chief Wright, but didn't have the great start?
Good on you. That's what I would say to those airmen. Good on you. I think we need, that's the way I think that you learn, the way that you grow. That's will ultimately make you a better leader. Stumbling out of the blocks, having some challenges, having a little bit of trouble. We all need that. You know, when you go to the gym to work out, if you lift 5 pounds and you don't shred those muscles, they won't grow. And I'm not saying that you have to have the career that I had, that you have to stumble and get in trouble and be undisciplined and curse everybody out and do all the things that I did. But I actually appreciate and I actually look for individuals, and I have the fantastic opportunity now to hire my staff, like most senior folks in the Air Force. And that's something that I actually look for. Hey, tell me about some troubles you've had in the past and how you overcame it. Because I think that says a lot about people. And if for those of us in the room who are leaders, you have to learn to appreciate that. You have to learn to appreciate someone that got an Article 15 when they were a young airman, and now they've made it all the way to be a tech sergeant or a master sergeant or a chief. You have to appreciate some of the mistakes that airmen make and what it ultimately means to them, their resilience and their ability to be effective as leaders in our Air Force.
Thanks, Chief. You know, I went out to, had a chance to talk a couple weeks ago at the Air Force Academy to the National Character Leadership Symposium, and I shared the story with the cadets that, you know, I had two completely different experiences as a cadet at the Air Force Academy in my 6 years there. And the first one, of course, you know, when I arrived at the Academy, my older brother, Steve, who's just an incredible officer, great airman, you know, he had been the cadet wing commander when General Walters and I showed up. And unbeknownst to me, when I was getting ready to start off as a young freshman, he had restricted the class of '81, the upperclassmen, for like 4 weekends in a row for doing just terrible things like, not staring straight ahead. And, when they walked and, putting their hands in their pockets. It was just terrible things that this class did, and they got restricted for a month. And then they became upperclassmen, and I showed up. And I had no idea that my name was actually pronounced Goldfein. Drive on out here. And so I was trying to make my own way in the world. And, if you're trying to make your own path and your older brother is perfect, the only avenue available to you is anti-perfect. And so I shared with the cadets, and I share with you, that I spent my first 2 years fighting the organization. And then we made a mutual decision between the Air Force Academy and Cadet Goldfein that maybe I needed to leave and get my act together. And so I left and rode a 10-speed bicycle, because that's how many speeds there were available in 1980, around the country for an entire year. And as I traveled around the country, and people took me in, total strangers who would come up and talk to me and bring me in, take care of me, I came to the conclusion on my own that this nation is worth defending. And I came back with a newfound love of our country, and I went back to the academy. And my last 2 years were a completely different experience. And the only thing that changed between the first 2 years and the last 2 years is I embraced what the academy was trying to do. And I realized that the world didn't actually revolve around Dave Goldfein. That actually I was part of something really big. And that there's opportunity to serve others. And once I embraced what the academy was trying to teach me, the whole world changed for me. And so I offer that story to you, and then let's all of us do our own mirror check here. Where are we on our journey? Where are you on your journey? You fighting the institution, or are you embracing the institution? And as leaders, are we looking at this business of leadership from the eyes of a servant, or from the eyes of someone who feels entitled? And I think if we embrace the institution, the values that we stand for, our airmen are going to want to follow us, because leadership is a gift, and it's given by those that we serve. Yeah.
I think I'll just pile on a little bit. Most of us, and maybe most of you in this room, who don't have a bump or a bruise in your record, doesn't mean you didn't have one in your career. Sometimes it means you just didn't get caught. Right?
Yeah. So, in keeping with our theme of, I resemble that remark, but
that would be the difference between a Dallas Cowboy fan and a Washington Redskins fan.
Last year, keeping in our theme of innovation, there was a lot of talk about the frozen middle. And there's a lot of questions about the frozen middle, because the theory goes, airmen have all these great ideas, and particularly as we watch Spark Tank, you get the senior leaders on the stage, and they're all saying, yeah, let's go. And there seems to be something in the middle holding those good ideas from reaching the top where they can get approved or get resources. So the basic question is does the frozen middle still exist? And if it does, how do we break it up?
Yeah, so, we talked about the frozen middle a little bit last year, and I think the thing that I would want everybody to know, that this is not necessarily always a bad thing. We have a little bit of I always talk about our group of chiefs. We have our own little kind of frozen middle, and actually we need it to some extent, because let me tell you about how we operate. We think about or get a new idea like eliminating WOPS testing, and here's me. All right, let's do it. I'm jumping off the cliff, and we'll figure it out on the way down how to, right? And then we have some folks in our group that says, hey, wait a minute, Chief, we need to do some data, we need to do some research, we need to make sure that this makes sense. To a certain extent, they operate in our group as the frozen middle. And I understand why this part of our Air Force exists because, you know, we come up with the grand ideas and we say, hey, go forth and prosper. But somebody actually, many of you in this room actually have to do this work, has to do this research, has to accept this risk, have to make sure that we stay out of hot water. So it's not altogether a bad thing, but we do need to figure out as an Air Force how we unleash all these airmen that were on this stage yesterday. All these airmen, because, you know, we only had 5 or 6 groups of airmen yesterday, but there are airmen all across this Air Force that have ideas that will save time, that will save money, that will allow us to do our jobs as we think about how we might fight in near-peer adversaries better, cheaper, smarter, faster. So how do we find the right balance in allowing them to grow? And to me is really all about risk. And how do we learn to take some calculated risk?
You know, I think we got to I do think we got to embrace the fact that a little bit of resistance and a little bit of dissent is part of our culture. I mean, we led the great jihad of 1947. That was a joke. And I joke sometimes and say, you know, if my buddy, General Neller, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, was standing up here and he made an announcement to the United States Marine Corps. He says, okay, on Friday, we're all wearing white gloves. There'll be some grumbling, right? But by God, on Friday afternoon, you know, the United States Marine Corps will be lining up wearing white gloves. The Chief of Staff of the Air Force was to announce today, on Friday, we're all wearing white gloves. The first response will be, what the hell? Does he want white gloves? I think he wanted one white glove, not 2 white. I think he was maybe gray gloves, not white. So a little bit of resistance and a little bit of dissent is sort of part of who we are. And so the way I look at the frozen middle, and a question for us is, how do you melt it? How do you get through any layers of resistance and dissent if it's actually a little bit of part of who we are? What's the flamethrower? What's the torch we can put on it that actually can melt that? And I think it's trust. It's trust up and down the organization. It's the 2 of us and the Secretary of the Air Force reinforcing this message that we absolutely, completely trust the leaders in our Air Force at all levels to make the right decisions because we prepared them well and they know what they need more than anybody else. It's trust across the organization so that the org chart of the United States Air Force has the chief and I and the secretary at the bottom and squadron leadership at the top, and an understanding that we actually all exist to make sure that they can get the mission done, that they can take care of airmen, that they can establish in the squadron the culture of that organization where the right thing is really easy and the wrong thing is really hard. So if we can continue to build on the foundation of trust across our Air Force, I'm absolutely confident that the frozen middle, which is always going to be a part of who we are, will get smaller and smaller over time.
Yeah, I mean, if we just have people in our Air Force that are saying no for no's sake, just because I'm in the position and I can say no, or just because, you know, they want to save their jobs, then that's not productive. But again, if this type of dissent forces you to think more deeply about what it is you're trying to do, let's take the young man who was the very first contestant yesterday on Spark Tank. So first, we were kind of in practice mode when we started Spark Tank. You know, we were, hey, let's have some fun with this. And Mark Cuban was full game, laces tied up. Hey, this is real. Like, all right, but look what happened when he pressed him a little bit. He pressed him about, hey, I'm not going to give you a spark. And he asked him some really tough questions that we would sometimes equate to, hey, you're just being part of the frozen middle. And look what happened. He thought a little bit more deeply about why this was a good idea. And then he pushed back and he came up with the reason for, hey, this is why we need to be able to do this. When the frozen middle comes in that form, man, it's good for all of us.
So a lot of airmen sent in a lot of questions regarding social media. And more specifically, I suppose there's at least in my career, there's always haters out there that tell you what you can't do or what you shouldn't do. But a lot of airmen are frustrated because there's a lot of folks out on blogs that have a lot of negative things to say, sometimes about Air Force leaders, and the airmen that wrote in aren't happy about it. So what is your advice to them about how to sort of change that? How do you address that? They don't like all this negativity they see on a lot of these blog sites.
So I think whether it's on social media or however people communicate, and since we're talking about social media, people have a right to their opinion. And they don't have to like everything that we do. Now, I would ask that just like in your work environment, that when you're on social media, you be respectful. And I tell you what I do, the things that I don't like reading, I don't read, and I don't pay attention to. The feedback that I think is useful for me, I take it and I try to implement it. If I don't, I laugh or I cry or however it makes me feel, and then I move on with the rest of my life. So I think all of us, there are some very good social media sites. There are some that are, relatively negative, and there are some that are somewhere in between. And just like I would encourage anyone when it comes to watching the news, right? Make sure you have a variety, you get it from all perspectives. Some of the sites that typically have some negative information, actually sometimes they raise very good points, they raise very good questions that we actually take back and address. But I would never go out and say, hey, you guys stop saying this or stop criticizing us. We welcome that criticism. We need that criticism. But I think we've become pretty good, and certainly, and I say we, I'm talking about our public affairs teammates that help us with this social media thing, have become really good at helping us understand, hey, this is useful, this is not.
And the other thing was we got to look at, in every echelon of command and leadership, right, from the chief to a squadron flight commander, right, we're in a new era where social media is part of who we are, and it's part of the communication. It's a communication tool. So the question is challenge or opportunity? And I would offer a little bit of both. Because there's an opportunity. I mean, my experience back when, as a squadron commander, was my primary method of communication was a walkabout, right, and all calls, right? There was no social media, if you would, to communicate. And so now, today, here we are where airmen, right, can communicate directly with squadron leadership. And so that's both challenge and opportunity, because the challenge, of course, is that we are a hierarchical, disciplined organization where we have rank structure and organizational layers. And we need those lower organizational layers because it's how we fight. It's how we employ combat power. And it's how we remain disciplined. So we have to have those layers. But now we have this opportunity as well for airmen who have a question about something to get answers straight from the source. And so I think it's a double-edged sword that we have to think about. How do we maintain the hierarchical nature of a military organization that employs lethal force, that's responsible for the most destructive weaponry on the planet, and who the nation holds to a very high standard when it comes to our values and the fact that we go to war with our values? How do we use these tools to become better as an organization? And there's some great, there was, let's see, a wing commander at 1st SAO, Colonel Tom Polensky. And we were joking a little bit. I brought him, his punishment for excellence was we brought him up to the Pentagon to be an exec. But he was in the wing commander. We used to joke a little bit back and forth about Facebook followers, right? And there was one particular email that he put out, or a Facebook post that he put out that somebody sent me, and it said, hey, wing, chief, secretary have been telling us that we have decision authority to stop doing things that don't directly contribute to our mission. And I want you to move out. And I am your top cover. Questions? Here's my email account. And I, of course, took that and reposted it. The secretary reposted it, right, to get out there. And so, again, challenge and opportunity. I think there's probably more opportunity than challenge for us in the age of social media, if we get it right.
Okay, and I know you all want about 5 minutes for sort of a couple of summary charts. So let me ask you one last question. what does it mean to you both to be Airmen for life?
So I'm second generation Airman. My dad served 33 years in the Air Force, flew in Vietnam. My older brother retired as a two-star. My younger brother retired as lieutenant colonel. My daughter's a serving airman. My nephew's a serving airman. This is our daughter, our nephew. This is family business. And so the opportunity to continue as part of this long blue line and to follow the incredible warriors of our past, many of whom are here today, and I would especially call out our Vietnam veterans who stayed in and rebuilt our service and rebuilt our military so that when Captain Goldfein went into Desert Storm, we had an unbelievable Air Force. And if we go to war this year, we're going to go to war with the Air Force that was built by John Jumper, Mike Ryan, Mark Welsh, and their Chief Master Sergeants of the Air Force. Such is the nature of lead time to build air forces. I think a lot about Chief 24, who is a brigadier general today and perhaps in this room. And she or he will go to war in 2030 with the Air Force that we build. That's the long blue line. And that to me is what it means to be an Airman for life.
March the 29th, 2019 will mark 30 years in the United States Air Force for me. So I've been an airman my entire adult life. As I, at some point, transition out of this job and out of our Air Force, many of my friends, many of the folks that I've had the pleasure of mentoring, many of the folks that have contributed to my success will continue to serve, and I'll continue to serve right alongside with them, in or out of uniform. Chief Master Sergeants of the Air Force have a long-standing tradition of continuing to be involved in our United States Air Force, and I know many of you have had the pleasure of being in audiences and hearing Bob Gaylor and Sam Parrish, and even one of our, as the perfect example we have here with us today, and at every AFA certainly that I've ever been to, our Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force, number 14, Gerald Murray. So Chief, thank you. So I'll continue that tradition of being an airman for the rest of my entire life and continuing to contribute to the success of our Air Force.
Want to wrap up?
Wrap up, yeah. All right, next slide, please. We'd be remiss if we, in terms of talking about inspiration and great leadership, we didn't talk a little bit about John Chapman. And I know all of you know the story of John Chapman and his time on that mountain in Takragar in Afghanistan. And you've probably even heard the chief talk about this picture that he has in his office, where a day or so prior to John's death, they were, the Afghan army was trying to get into this safe house, and the army wanted to kick the family out, and part of the family was this little girl. And John stood his ground, and he made sure, because the room that they tried to kick him out of was the only room in the house that had heat. And John stood his ground and made sure that this little girl, who happened to be the same age of his daughter at the time this picture was taken. We've all been inspired by, and I certainly personally have been inspired by John and what he did for all of us. And we posthumously promoted him to Master Sergeant this year, and more importantly, he received the Medal of Honor this year.
So for all the leaders in the room, and leaders to be. This is the kind of airmen that we're privileged to lead. And a question for us, all of us, to think about is, are we worthy? Are we worthy of the gift of being able to lead John Chapman? Are we worthy of the trust and the confidence that the nation has placed in us when they send their sons and daughters to the United States Air Force? If we get this leadership thing right, here's what happens. You become a leader for life to that individual. And whether it's squadron, wing, group, command, it's happened here this week. One of the blessings is that folks will come up to you and they'll say, or they'll send you an email, they'll find you on the global and they say, hey, you don't remember me, but I served in your squadron back in Aviano or Spangdahlem or Holloman or you name the base. And you probably don't remember this, but you called me into the office and I was going through a really rough time. And while I didn't appreciate the tough love at the time, I went out and got the help that you told me to go get. And I kept my family together. I was able to get my finances. I got my act together after that meeting, and I'm just contacting you to tell you I just made Senior Master Sergeant, and I have you to thank. Does it get any better than that? That's the gift of servant leadership. That's the gift that we've been given. We can buy all the technology on the planet. We can be the most technical force. We can do all the things that we're talking about with acquisition. And it adds up to very little if we don't have the airmen we need to take the fight to the enemy and do the nation's business. And so we have to fly, fight, and stay to win. And it's on all of us to ensure that we build and rebuild and reinforce the culture of an airman and the culture of an Air Force. Because it's never been more important time to serve. And I know for the chief and I, we couldn't be prouder to serve with you each and every day. God bless you all. Thank you very much. Thank you.